Some words once spoken can never be taken back. England, 1808. The ancient stone walls of St. Mary's Church in London had witnessed countless marriages over the centuries, but none quite so heavy with unspoken dread as the union about to take place on this gray April morning. The air inside carried the mingled scent of beeswax candles, aged wood, and the faint perfume of hothouse roses that had been arranged along the altar rail at considerable expense. Light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the assembled congregation, all dressed in their finest morning attire. Lady Georgiana Fairmont stood in the small anteroom adjacent to the main chapel, her gloved fingers clasped tightly before her as she studied her reflection in the modest-looking glass. At 24, she had long since abandoned the foolish dreams of youth. The woman who gazed back at her wore a pale blue morning gown of fine muslin, its modest neckline appropriate for a church ceremony, its simple elegance chosen more for practicality than beauty. Her chestnut hair had been arranged in a neat chignon at the nape of her neck, with a few soft curls framing her oval face. She knew what she saw there. Features that were pleasant enough but unremarkable. A straight nose that was perhaps a touch too prominent. Brown eyes that held intelligence rather than coquettish charm. Lips that were too often pressed into a line of determination rather than curved in flirtation. "You look lovely, dearest," her younger sister Victoria offered from her position near the door, though even her practiced flattery could not quite mask the pity in her voice. At 21, Victoria possessed the kind of golden beauty that turned heads in ballrooms, her blonde curls and blue eyes the very picture of English rose perfection. She wore a gown of primrose yellow that complemented her coloring admirably, already anticipating the season she would enjoy once Georgiana's sacrifice secured her future. When the room had quieted, Adrian lifted his glass. "I have long prided myself on discernment, yet on the very day of my marriage, I proved myself a blind and graceless fool. Before witnesses, I spoke words unworthy of a gentleman, and of the lady who is now my wife. The Duchess of Ravenmore has since shown more courage and competence than I have ever deserved. If there is honor in me, let it begin with this. I beg her pardon, publicly and without reserve." He did not rest on apology. He set his seal to the school and infirmary endowments, granted the steward full charter, and fixed his visits by Eleanor's seasons. A murmur rippled through the company, not scandal, but a sober recognition. Georgiana did not incline her head. She met his gaze levelly, the quiet strength of a woman who had endured and prevailed. "Thank you, Victoria," Georgiana replied quietly, adjusting the simple pearl earrings that had belonged to her late mother. "Is father ready?" The Viscount Edmund Fairmont entered at that moment, his handsome features marred by the telltale signs of too many years devoted to cards and brandy. At 55, he retained the bearing of a gentleman, though his eyes held a desperate relief that made Georgiana's chest tighten. "The Duke has arrived," he announced, his voice carrying the forced joviality of a man who had narrowly escaped ruin. "Come, my dear. Let us not keep his grace waiting." Georgiana took her father's offered arm, feeling the slight tremor in his hand. This marriage would erase his gambling debts, restore the family name, and provide Victoria with the substantial dowry necessary to secure her own advantageous match. That was the bargain that had been struck, the price Georgiana had agreed to pay without complaint or protest. The church doors opened, and the assembled guests rose as one. Georgiana kept her gaze fixed ahead, refusing to acknowledge the curious stares and whispered comments that followed her progress down the aisle. She knew what they said, that the plain eldest daughter of the impoverished Fairmont family had somehow secured the most eligible bachelor in England through her father's desperate negotiations. The Duke of Ravenmore, whose wealth and title made him one of the most sought-after prizes in society, marrying a woman with neither beauty nor fortune to recommend her. Kent was profitable, newly acquired and well-kept. Devonshire was legacy. Ravenmore the principal seat, with obligations that could not be met from a London club. Adrian Montague stood at the altar, tall and imposing in his dark morning coat and pristine cravat. At 30 years of age, he embodied aristocratic perfection, his chestnut hair swept back from a face that might have been carved from marble, all sharp angles and classical proportions. His gray-blue eyes, cool and assessing, barely glanced at Georgiana as she took her place beside him. She could feel the rigid disapproval emanating from his frame, though his expression remained carefully neutral. The ceremony began with the familiar words from the Book of Common Prayer, the vicar's voice echoing through the stone chamber. Georgiana responded to each prompt with quiet clarity, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. Adrian's responses were equally measured, correct in every particular, devoid of any warmth. Then came the moment for the vows themselves. The vicar turned to Adrian first, asking if he would take Georgiana to be his wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward. Adrian's gaze swept over Georgiana then, truly looking at her for the first time since she had approached the altar. She saw his eyes trace her unremarkable features, saw the moment of assessment, the comparison to whatever ideal he had constructed in his mind. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The pause stretched. The congregation held its collective breath. Georgiana felt heat rising to her cheeks, but kept her expression composed, her chin lifted with dignity she did not feel. Finally, Adrian spoke. But the words that came were not the simple affirmation the ceremony required. Instead, in a voice that carried clearly to the first 3 rows of pews, he murmured, "Too plain for a duchess." The words struck like a physical blow. Gasps rippled through the assembled guests. Georgiana felt the blood drain from her face, but years of training in deportment and self-control prevented her from flinching. She did not look away from Adrian's face, did not allow the tears that threatened to show themselves, did not give him or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. The vicar cleared his throat awkwardly, uncertain how to proceed. Adrian, seeming to realize the enormity of what he had just done, quickly added the required, "I will," though the damage had been thoroughly done. When the vicar turned to Georgiana, asking for her consent, she answered clearly, "I will," her voice carrying a strength that surprised even herself. If Adrian Montague thought her plain, so be it. She would not be the one to break this contract, would not shame her family further by fleeing or refusing. The remainder of the ceremony proceeded with mechanical precision. Rings were exchanged, prayers were recited, and the vicar pronounced them man and wife before God and these witnesses. Adrian made no move to kiss his bride, and Georgiana did not expect one. They signed the register with hands that did not touch, witnessed by Victoria and Adrian's friend Lord Hampton, whose expression conveyed acute discomfort. The short journey from the church to Fairmont House for the wedding breakfast took place in Adrian's carriage, the first time they had been alone together. The silence between them was suffocating. Georgiana sat ramrod straight on one side of the carriage, Adrian on the other, both staring out opposite windows at the passing London streets. "I trust," Georgiana said finally, her voice low but steady, "that you will at least maintain the appearance of civility before our guests, Your Grace." Adrian's gaze snapped to her face, surprise evident that she had spoken at all. "Of course," he replied stiffly. "I am not without manners, madam. Your conduct at the altar would suggest otherwise," Georgiana countered, then immediately regretted the sharpness of her tone. She took a breath, moderating her voice. "What is done is done. We are married now, bound by law and before God. I ask only that you not humiliate me further." Something flickered in Adrian's eyes, perhaps the first stirring of conscience, but he merely nodded. "You have my word." The wedding breakfast at Fairmont House was a carefully choreographed affair of polite conversation and false smiles. Georgiana moved through the receiving line with grace, accepting congratulations that rang hollow in her ears. Victoria clung to her arm, whispering apologies that meant nothing, while their father toasted the happy couple with barely concealed triumph at his own salvation. Adrian performed his role adequately, standing at Georgiana's side, occasionally placing his hand at the small of her back when propriety demanded, but never meeting her eyes directly. She could feel the stiffness in his posture, the reluctance in every gesture. When Lady Pembroke, a notorious gossip, commented on what a handsome couple they made, Adrian's smile was so forced it resembled a grimace. As the afternoon wore on and guests began to depart, Georgiana felt a growing sense of dread about the evening to come. Society expected a wedding night, expected the consummation that would make this union truly binding. She had been prepared, in the abstract, for this duty. But the reality of sharing intimacy with a man who found her displeasing was almost more than she could bear to contemplate. When the last guest had finally departed, and the household began clearing away the remnants of the celebration, Adrian turned to her with an expression of resignation. "I have taken the liberty of arranging separate chambers for us at Ravenmore House," he said, his tone formal. "We shall depart within the hour. I trust you have prepared your things?" "Yes, Your Grace," Georgiana replied, grateful at least that they would not be spending their wedding night under her father's roof. The journey to Ravenmore House in Mayfair was mercifully brief. The Duke's London residence was a magnificent townhouse of pale stone, its windows gleaming in the fading afternoon light. Servants lined up to greet their new mistress, their expressions carefully neutral. Georgiana was shown to a suite of rooms that were elegant and impersonal, clearly prepared for a duchess but holding no warmth or welcome. As night fell and her maid helped her prepare for bed, Georgiana steeled herself for Adrian's arrival. But when the connecting door between their chambers finally opened, what followed was not romance or even courtesy. Adrian entered without knocking, still fully dressed, his expression distant. "I shall fulfill my obligation," he stated flatly. Nothing more. And so he did, with a clinical efficiency that made Georgiana feel more like a transaction than a wife. There were no tender words, no gentle touches, nothing but the mechanical completion of a duty. When it was over, Adrian rose immediately, adjusted his clothing, and moved toward the door without a backward glance. "Your Grace," Georgiana called out, pulling the bedclothes around herself. "Will you not stay?" He paused at the threshold, his hand on the door frame. "I see no reason to prolong this discomfort for either of us, madam. Good night." The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded to Georgiana like a prison door locking. She lay alone in the darkness of her marriage bed, staring at the canopy above her, and made a decision. She would not weep. She would not rage. She would not allow Adrian Montague's cruelty to define her existence. If he found her too plain to be a proper duchess, she would prove him wrong in every way that mattered. She would be the most competent, most capable, most irreproachable duchess that Ravenmore had ever known. And if he never came to love her, never even came to like her, she would build a life of purpose and dignity regardless. The plain daughter of a ruined viscount had survived this long by adapting, by finding strength where others sought only to find fault. She would survive this too, and perhaps, in time, she would even find a measure of peace. But tonight, in the hollow silence of her wedding night, Georgiana Montague, Duchess of Ravenmore, allowed herself one moment of grief for the marriage that might have been, before pushing it aside and looking toward the uncertain future with clear, determined eyes. The morning after the wedding dawned cold and gray over London. Georgiana woke alone in the vast bed of her chamber at Ravenmore House, the space beside her unmarked and undisturbed. She had not expected otherwise, but the confirmation of her isolation stung nonetheless. Through the tall windows, she could see the city stirring to life, carriages rattling over cobblestones, servants hurrying about their morning duties, the world continuing as though nothing of consequence had occurred. A soft knock at the door preceded the entrance of a middle-aged woman in crisp servant's attire, her expression professionally neutral. "Good morning, Your Grace. I am Mrs. Talbot, the housekeeper. His Grace has instructed me to attend to your needs while you are in residence." "Thank you, Mrs. Talbot," Georgiana replied, sitting up and reaching for the dressing gown that had been laid out at the foot of the bed. "Has the Duke risen?" "His Grace departed for his club an hour ago, Your Grace. He left word that he will be traveling to his estates in Kent this afternoon and does not expect to return to London for some weeks." The words, delivered with careful neutrality, nonetheless conveyed their true meaning. Adrian was leaving. Less than a day after their marriage, he was abandoning her in the unfamiliar surroundings of his London house without so much as a farewell. Georgiana kept her expression composed. "I see. Then I shall prepare to travel to Ravenmore Estate in Devonshire. I assume that is where I am expected to reside?" Mrs. Talbot's eyebrows rose slightly, the first crack in her professional demeanor. "His Grace made no mention of your plans, Your Grace, but Ravenmore Estate is indeed the principal seat. It has been without a mistress these 5 years since the old Duchess passed. Then it is past time it had one again, Georgiana said firmly. Please have my things prepared for departure tomorrow morning. I should like to reach Devonshire before the week is out. If Mrs. Talbot was surprised by this decisiveness from the new Duchess, whom rumor painted as a meek victim of circumstance, she gave no sign beyond a respectful curtsy. Very good, Your Grace. Shall I have breakfast brought to your chamber? No, thank you. I shall take it in the morning room if one exists. I have no intention of hiding in my chambers. 2 days later, Georgiana's carriage rolled through the gates of Ravenmore Estate as afternoon shadows stretched across the parkland. The house itself was magnificent, a sprawling Palladian structure of honey-colored stone that seemed to glow in the late spring sunshine. Gardens that had once been formal and manicured showed signs of neglect, with hedges growing wild and flower beds choked with weeds. It was beautiful despite its disorder, or perhaps because of it, holding a melancholy dignity that resonated with something deep in Georgiana's chest. The household staff assembled to greet their new mistress numbered fewer than she had expected for an estate of this size. At their head stood an elderly man who introduced himself as Mr. Dawson, the butler who had served the Montague family for 40 years. His weathered face held skepticism as he bowed over Georgiana's hand. Welcome to Ravenmore, Your Grace. We had no word of your arrival, else we should have made better preparations. No fault of yours, Mr. Dawson, Georgiana replied, her voice kind but authoritative. I gave little notice of my intentions. I trust chambers have been prepared for me. The Duchess's suite has been maintained, Your Grace, though it has not been occupied since the late Duchess's passing. Georgiana spent her first week at Ravenmore, learning the rhythms of the household and the extent of its disarray. The late Duchess, Adrian's mother, had died when he was 25, and in the years since, the estate had been managed by a series of increasingly negligent stewards. The current man, a Mr. Griggs, spent more time in the nearby village tavern than attending to his duties. Accounts were incomplete, repairs had been deferred, and the tenants lived in conditions that made Georgiana's heart ache with their quiet endurance of hardship. She began with the ledgers, spending long hours in the estate office deciphering the mess of incomplete entries and unexplained expenditures. Her father's financial troubles had forced her to develop a keen understanding of accounts and management, skills she now employed with determined focus. Within a fortnight, she had identified thousands of pounds that had simply vanished into Griggs's pockets through fraudulent invoices and fictional expenses. Mrs. Talbot, Georgiana said one morning, summoning the housekeeper to her study, I require your honest assessment of Mr. Griggs. The housekeeper's lips pressed into a thin line. He is a scoundrel, Your Grace, if you will pardon my bluntness. The late Duke, His Grace's father, was the same, cared only for appearances, not substance. Mr. Griggs understood this and took full advantage, but His Grace, the current Duke, has not set foot on this estate above twice in the past year, and then only briefly. None dared complain without someone to hear them. I am here to hear them now, Georgiana said quietly, and Mr. Griggs will be dismissed by week's end. I shall require someone trustworthy to assist with the accounts until a proper steward can be found. If I may be so bold, Your Grace, there is Thomas Whitley, who has served as clerk in the village. He is honest and capable, though young. Send for him, please. And Mrs. Talbot, I should like to visit the tenants' cottages, tomorrow, if weather permits. The visit to the tenants revealed conditions worse than the ledgers had suggested. Roofs leaked, walls crumbled, children wore clothing too thin for the climate. But more disturbing was the resignation in the faces of the families she met, the expectation that their complaints would go unheard and their suffering unrelieved. Things will change, Georgiana promised an elderly woman whose cottage roof had collapsed partially into the living quarters. You have my word. Repairs will begin this week. Begging Your Grace's pardon, the woman said quietly, but we have heard such promises before. Then I shall prove myself different through actions, not words, Georgiana replied. And she did. Working with Thomas Whitley, a serious young man of 28, whose honesty was matched only by his competence, Georgiana began the work of restoring Ravenmore to proper functioning. Griggs was dismissed despite his protests. Cottages were repaired, accounts were balanced, and a small school was established in the village for the tenants' children. The servants, initially wary of this plain duchess who had arrived without fanfare or the duke's attendance, gradually came to respect her for her capability and her genuine concern for their welfare. A letter arrived from Victoria in midsummer, written in her younger sister's looping script. "Dearest Georgiana," it began, "I cannot adequately express my gratitude for the generous settlement that has accompanied your marriage. Thanks to your sacrifice, I have been the toast of the season. 3 gentlemen have already made inquiries with father, including the charming Baronet Sir Michael Thornbury. Father is quite pleased with the attention, and I believe I shall be engaged before autumn. You must be so happy to have secured such an illustrious position. I confess the Duke seems rather severe in manner, but surely his wealth and title compensate for any deficiency in warmth. Do write and tell me all about Ravenmoor. Victoria." Georgiana set the letter aside, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. Victoria was happy, secure, her future bright with promise. The sacrifice had served its purpose, yet there was no real acknowledgement in her sister's words of what that sacrifice had cost, no recognition of the humiliation Georgiana had endured, or the loneliness that now defined her days. A second letter, this one more formal, informed her that the Viscount Fairmont's debts had been settled in full as stipulated in the marriage contract. Her father's brief note of thanks that accompanied it was perfunctory, expressing relief rather than gratitude, making no mention of his daughter's well-being or his concern for her happiness. "So," Georgiana murmured to herself as she folded both letters and placed them in her writing desk, "I have fulfilled my purpose admirably. And now I must discover what purpose I might serve here." The answer came in the work itself, in the gradual transformation of Ravenmoor from neglected estate to thriving community. She discovered within herself a talent for administration and a genuine pleasure in seeing improvements take tangible form. The school flourished under the guidance of a young woman from the village who could read and write. The tenants began to trust that their new duchess meant what she said. The household ran with renewed order and pride. 3 months into her residence at Ravenmoor, Adrian returned unannounced for a dinner party being hosted by a neighboring baronet, an event he could not avoid without causing offense. Georgiana had received only a day's notice of his arrival, barely enough time to ensure his chambers were prepared and his preferred meals planned. She was in the drawing room reviewing menus with Mrs. Talbot when Dawson announced, "His Grace, the Duke of Ravenmoor." Adrian entered, still in his traveling clothes, dust from the road clinging to his boots. He stopped short when he saw Georgiana, as though he had somehow forgotten she would be present in his own house. For a moment, neither spoke, simply taking the measure of one another after months apart. "Your Grace," Georgiana said finally, rising and curtsying with perfect correctness. "Welcome home. I trust your journey from London was tolerable?" "It was," Adrian replied stiffly. "I apologize for the short notice of my arrival. The Havisham dinner is tomorrow evening, and I thought it best to rest here rather than impose on their household." "Of course. Your chambers are prepared, and cook has been instructed regarding your preferences." Adrian's gaze moved around the drawing room, taking in the fresh flowers in the vases, the newly polished silver, the overall air of careful maintenance. Something shifted in his expression, though Georgiana could not quite interpret it. "The house looks well," he said finally. "Thank you, Your Grace. I have endeavored to maintain proper standards." Over dinner that evening, the first meal they had shared since their wedding, the conversation remained painfully formal. Adrian sat at the head of the table, Georgiana at its far end, with servants moving silently between them to serve each course. She told him briefly about the dismissal of Mr. Griggs and the appointment of Thomas Whitley, about the repairs to the tenants' cottages and the establishment of the school. "You have been busy," Adrian observed, his tone neutral. "I saw much that needed attention," Georgiana replied. "I hope I have not overstepped. I know these are your estates, but I assumed a duchess should take some interest in their management." "You assumed correctly," Adrian said, though his voice remained distant. "My father neglected this property in favor of his London interests. I confess I have followed his example, to the estate's detriment." "Then perhaps it is fortunate I had little else to occupy my time," Georgiana said, unable to keep a slight edge from her voice. Adrian looked at her sharply, but before he could respond, Dawson entered to announce that the Dowager Duchess Clarissa Montague had arrived and was requesting an audience with the Duke and his wife. Adrian's expression shifted to something that might have been resignation, or perhaps relief at the interruption. "Show her to the library, Dawson. We shall attend her directly." The Dowager Duchess proved to be a tiny woman with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes that missed nothing. At 75, she retained an upright bearing and a sharp wit that became immediately apparent. "So," she said, without preamble after the introductions had been made, "you are the girl Adrian married and then abandoned like yesterday's newspaper. I should like to know more about you, child. Adrian, pour me some sherry and then sit down and be quiet. This conversation is between your wife and myself." To Georgiana's amazement, Adrian did exactly as commanded, though his jaw tightened at his grandmother's characterization of his behavior. For the next hour, Clarissa questioned Georgiana about her background, her education, her interests, and her work at Ravenmore. Unlike the perfunctory interest society had shown her, the old woman listened with genuine attention, occasionally nodding or making sharp observations that revealed her own keen understanding of estate management. "You have done more in 3 months than my fool of a grandson has done in 3 years, Clarissa said finally, fixing Adrian with a look of distinct disapproval. "His father was the same, you know. My son cared only for appearances, for beauty and status, and the opinions of fashionable London. He raised Adrian to value the same foolish priorities. But competence, child, competence and character, those are what truly matter in a wife, in a duchess, in a human being." Adrian shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers tightening around his glass. "Grandmother," he began, but Clarissa waved him to silence. "I am not finished. Adrian, you have made your new wife's life miserable with your coldness and your absence. But she has not sat idle feeling sorry for herself, has she? She has proven herself more capable than you deserve. I suggest you take note of that fact." After Clarissa departed, Georgiana excused herself quickly, unwilling to face whatever conversation might follow the old woman's pointed criticisms. But Adrian's voice stopped her at the library door. "A moment, if you please." She turned, hands clasped before her, waiting. "I should like to review the estate accounts with you tomorrow," Adrian said, his voice carefully controlled. "Before the dinner party, if that is convenient." "Of course, Your Grace. I have prepared detailed reports that document all expenditures and improvements. I believe you will find everything in order." The following morning, they sat across from each other in the estate office, as Georgiana presented ledger after ledger, explaining her decisions, showing the cost savings achieved, the increased productivity from tenants who no longer feared unfair treatment. Adrian listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, occasionally making notes or asking for clarification on specific points. When she finished, he sat back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "This is exceptional work," he said finally. "The improvements you have documented would take most stewards years to achieve, yet you have done it in a matter of months." "I had strong motivation," Georgiana replied quietly, "and little else to occupy my time." Something that might have been guilt flickered across Adrian's features, but he did not apologize or explain. Instead, he merely nodded, gathered the ledgers and left the room, leaving Georgiana alone with the hollow satisfaction of having earned his intellectual respect, if nothing more. Spring arrived in London with the kind of brilliant clarity that made the city's grime less noticeable and its society more eager to display itself. The season of 1809 promised to be particularly glittering, with debutantes fresh from their country estates, gentlemen returned from the continent, and the usual round of balls, music halls, and assemblies that defined aristocratic life. For Georgiana, it marked her first appearance in London society as the Duchess of Ravenmore, a prospect she faced with considerably less enthusiasm than dread. Adrian had returned to Ravenmore in late March with instructions that they would remove to London for the season. His announcement was delivered over breakfast with the same cool formality that characterized all their interactions, as though he were informing a household servant of a change in routine, rather than discussing plans with his wife. "We shall depart on Monday," he said, not looking up from his correspondence. "I have taken a house in Berkeley Square for the duration of the season. It will be more convenient than Ravenmore House, which requires too many staff for such temporary residence." "As you wish, Your Grace," Georgiana replied, setting down her teacup with careful precision. "Shall I make arrangements for my wardrobe? I confess my current gowns are more suited to country life than London society." Adrian glanced at her then, his gray-blue eyes sweeping over her morning dress of simple muslin. "Of course. I have established an account with Madame Celestine on Bond Street. She will attend you for fittings. As my Duchess, you must be appropriately attired." The unspoken end of that sentence hung between them, even if she could never be appropriately beautiful. London in full season assaulted the senses. The Berkeley Square house was elegant and well-appointed, its drawing rooms decorated in the height of fashion, its servants numerous and efficient. Georgiana spent her first week enduring endless fittings, as Madame Celestine created a wardrobe suitable for a duchess, though even the modiste's considerable skill could only enhance, never transform. "Your Grace has an elegant figure," Madame Celestine said diplomatically, as she pinned a gown of pale green silk. "These simpler styles suit you admirably. Classic rather than fashionable, if I may be so bold." Classic rather than fashionable, Georgiana thought wryly. Another way of saying plain rather than pretty. The first ball of the season was held at Devonshire House, a glittering affair attended by everyone of consequence. Georgiana descended the grand staircase on Adrian's arm, acutely conscious of the moment when conversation faltered and heads turned to observe the Duke of Ravenmore and his new Duchess. She heard the whispers, could read the expressions that ranged from curiosity to pity to barely concealed mockery. "Is that really the Duchess of Ravenmore? I heard he called her plain at the very altar. Poor creature. What must it be like to know your husband finds you repellent? At least she secured the title. Some would say that is compensation enough for an earl's daughter with no fortune." Adrian's arm beneath her gloved hand was rigid as iron, but his expression remained impassive. He led her through the receiving line, made the appropriate introductions, and then, duty discharged, abandoned her to the company of other matrons, while he joined a group of gentlemen near the card-room. Georgiana found herself standing alone near a pillar, watching the dancers swirl past in a kaleidoscope of color and movement. She recognized no one, and no one approached her, as though she carried some contagion that might spread through casual conversation. "Georgiana?" A familiar voice broke through her isolation. "Georgiana, is that truly you?" She turned to find Lady Henrietta Beaumont, her closest friend from before the marriage, approaching with genuine pleasure lighting her features. Henrietta, at 25, was the youngest daughter of the Earl of Dartmouth, possessed of a comfortable independence and an unfashionable tendency toward loyalty. "Henrietta," Georgiana breathed, relief flooding through her. "I did not know you were in London. We arrived last week. Father wanted to see to some parliamentary business, and I confess I was eager for the season's entertainments." Henrietta took Georgiana's hands, studying her face with concern. "I heard about your marriage. Georgiana, I am so sorry. The rumors have been quite dreadful." "Rumors have a way of being more dramatic than truth," Georgiana replied, though they both knew this particular rumor was entirely accurate. "I am well enough, Henrietta. Managing, Henrietta repeated with a sad smile. What a terribly low bar for happiness. "Come, you must tell me everything. Where has your husband gone? To the card room, I believe, or perhaps the refreshment table." "Anywhere but at my side." For the remainder of that evening, and many that followed, Henrietta became Georgiana's anchor in the treacherous waters of London society. They attended events together, took morning calls as a pair, and gradually, very gradually, other ladies began to accept Georgiana's presence, if not precisely welcome it. But the true test came at the Harrington Ball in mid-April, an event known for its exclusivity and elegance. Georgiana wore a gown of deep blue silk that brought out the warmth in her brown eyes, her hair arranged in a more elaborate style than usual. She felt almost confident as she entered on Adrian's arm, almost prepared to face the evening with equanimity. That confidence shattered when she saw the woman who commanded the center of the ballroom's attention. Lady Louisa Pembroke was everything Georgiana was not. Tall where Georgiana was average in height, golden-haired where Georgiana was chestnut, possessed of the kind of classical beauty that made men stare and women gnash their teeth with envy. At 29, she had been married briefly to an elderly earl who had conveniently died, leaving her wealthy, titled, and much sought after. Georgiana watched, a cold weight settling in her chest, as Adrian's eyes found Lady Louisa across the room. She saw the way his expression shifted, the way he stood a bit straighter, the way something that might have been admiration or interest flickered across his features. When Lady Louisa glanced in their direction and smiled, Adrian returned the expression with a warmth Georgiana had never seen directed at herself. "If you will excuse me," Adrian murmured, already moving away. "I see Lord Hampton wishes to speak with me." But it was not Lord Hampton he approached. Georgiana remained rooted to her spot as her husband crossed the ballroom and bowed over Lady Louisa's hand, engaging her in conversation that soon had the widow laughing, her fan fluttering coquettishly. Adrian stood close, attentive in a way that made the contrast to his treatment of Georgiana painfully clear. "He is a fool," Henrietta said quietly at her elbow. "An absolute fool." "He is my husband," Georgiana replied, her voice carefully neutral despite the pain that lanced through her chest. "And she is everything I am not. I can hardly fault him for preferring beauty to plainness." "Beauty fades," Henrietta said fiercely. "Character endures. Lady Louisa may be lovely to look upon, but she has the depth of a puddle and the kindness of a serpent." Before Georgiana could respond, a gentleman appeared at her other side, bowing with genuine courtesy. "Lady Georgiana? Forgive me, I should say Duchess. I am not certain you remember me. Christopher Wainwright. We knew each other as children, before your family moved to Wiltshire." Georgiana studied him, and recognition dawned. Christopher Wainwright had been a gangly boy with red hair and a ready smile, always willing to climb trees or explore ruins with the Fairmont sisters. Now he was a man of 28, still possessing that red hair, but grown into his height, his face open and kind, his green eyes warm with recognition. "Mr. Wainwright," she said, genuine pleasure in her voice. "Of course I remember. You taught Victoria and me how to catch frogs in the pond at Fairmont Park. Our governess was quite scandalized. A prouder moment of my youth I cannot recall," Christopher replied with a grin. "Though I confess I am shocked to find you here. I heard you had married, but I did not realize it was to Ravenmoor. Congratulations on your elevation, though I always thought you deserved more than just a title." The compliment, so casually given, brought unexpected warmth to Georgiana's cheeks. "You are kind, Mr. Wainwright. Are you in London for the season?" "In a manner of speaking. I have taken rooms while I attend to some business for my father. Being a second son, I must make myself useful in commerce rather than living off the family name." He gestured toward the refreshment table. "Might I escort you and Lady Henrietta to procure some lemonade? This ballroom is insufferably warm." For the next hour, Georgiana found herself laughing more genuinely than she had in months, as Christopher regaled them with stories of his travels and his attempts to navigate London's business world. He asked her opinion on agricultural reform, debated the merits of various philosophers, and listened with genuine interest when she described her work improving the Ravenmoor estate. It was the kind of conversation she had craved, intellectual and stimulating, treating her as a person of worth rather than an unwanted burden. Across the room, Adrian glanced over during a lull in his conversation with Lady Louisa and saw his wife's face animated with laughter, her eyes bright as she engaged with a red-haired gentleman he did not recognize. Something uncomfortable twisted in his chest, a sensation he could not quite identify. It was not jealousy, certainly. He had no claim to Georgiana's affections beyond the legal bonds of matrimony. Yet seeing her so clearly enjoying another man's company created a discord he could not ignore. "Your Grace?" Lady Louisa's voice recalled his attention. "You seem distracted. Forgive me, Lady Louisa. I was merely observing my wife. I do not recognize the gentleman with whom she converses." "Oh, that is Christopher Wainwright, second son of the Marquis of Alderton. Quite beneath your Duchess's notice, I should think, given his lack of prospects." Lady Louisa's voice held a note of dismissal that Adrian found suddenly grating. "He appears to be entertaining her admirably," Adrian heard himself say. then wondered why he felt compelled to defend a man he did not know in conversation with a woman whose beauty he found aesthetically pleasing, but increasingly hollow. The season progressed, and Georgiana discovered an unexpected social avenue opening before her. At a musicale hosted by the Duke of Portland, she was approached by Lady Margaret Sheffield, a woman of middle years known for her formidable intelligence, and her salon dedicated to intellectual discourse rather than idle gossip. "Your Grace," Lady Margaret said without preamble, "I have heard interesting things about your management of the Ravenmore estate. I host a gathering each Thursday afternoon for ladies interested in substantive conversation about philosophy, literature, and reform. I should be pleased if you would join us." Georgiana accepted eagerly, and within a fortnight found herself presenting a brief essay on agricultural reform to an audience of educated women who listened with genuine attention and offered thoughtful critiques. Her reputation among this set began to shift from that of pitied duchess to respected thinker, though the broader society still viewed her with condescension. A letter arrived from Victoria in early May, written in her sister's enthusiastic scrawl. "Dearest Georgiana, such wonderful news. Sir Michael Thornbury has proposed, and Father has accepted on my behalf. We are to be married in July, and I am already planning the most magnificent celebration. Father suggested I write to you regarding a wedding gift, as the Duke is surely generous to family. Perhaps a pair of matched greys for our carriage, or a substantial monetary settlement to establish our household. I know you will speak to His Grace on my behalf. How fortunate that your position allows you to assist me in this manner. Your loving sister, Victoria." Georgiana set the letter down, a complex knot of emotion tightening in her chest. Happiness for Victoria, certainly, but also a growing resentment at being treated as merely a conduit to Adrian's wealth, rather than a sister whose own well-being might merit inquiry. Victoria had asked nothing about Georgiana's life, her happiness, her struggles. She had simply assumed her elder sister existed to facilitate her desires. When Adrian returned home that evening from his club, Georgiana requested a private word in the library. He looked surprised but agreed, following her into the book-lined room with evident wariness. "Victoria is to be married," Georgiana said without preamble, handing him the letter. "She requests a generous wedding gift." Adrian scanned the letter, his expression unreadable. "Matched greys and a monetary settlement. Your sister has expensive tastes. She has been raised to expect such things," Georgiana replied evenly. "Part of the arrangement of our marriage was securing her future. I am merely fulfilling my obligation by informing you of her request." "You speak of obligation as though it brings you no pleasure," Adrian observed, setting the letter aside. "Should it?" The words escaped before Georgiana could prevent them. "My sister writes to request gifts, not to inquire after my well-being. My father has sent precisely one letter since our marriage, expressing satisfaction that his debts are resolved. Neither has asked if I am happy, if I am treated well, if I regret the sacrifice I made for their benefit. Tell me, Your Grace, why should fulfilling this obligation bring me pleasure?" Adrian's eyes narrowed. "You knew the terms when you accepted my proposal." "I accepted an arranged marriage," Georgiana countered, her voice rising slightly. "I did not accept public humiliation, abandonment, and coldness that would freeze the Thames in midsummer. But you are quite correct. I knew the terms. Foolishly, I thought there might be the possibility of something more than mutual toleration. I have since learned better." She moved toward the door, but Adrian's voice stopped her. "I have also heard reports of your attendance at Lady Margaret's salon. Some consider such gatherings improper for a duchess." Georgiana turned back, anger finally breaking through her carefully maintained composure. "And what do you consider proper, Your Grace? Sitting idle while you spend your evenings at your club, or paying court to Lady Louisa Pembroke? Pretending I am content to be a decorative addition to your household, acknowledged when convenient and ignored the remainder of the time. I have found companions who value my mind rather than my face, who engage with my thoughts rather than dismissing them. If that is improper, then I shall continue to be improper." "Georgiana!" Adrian began, but she had already left the room, her departure marked by the firm closing of the library door. Alone in the book-lined space, Adrian stood motionless, his grandmother's words from months ago echoing unbidden in his mind. competence and character. Those are what truly matter. He had dismissed them then, secure in his belief that he had made a practical arrangement that required nothing beyond basic courtesy. But watching Georgiana walk away, seeing the flash of genuine anger in her eyes, he felt the first stirring of something that might have been regret, or perhaps the beginning of a question he was not yet ready to ask himself. The summer heat pressed down on London with oppressive weight, turning the city into a furnace of stifling air and shortened tempers. Georgiana found herself increasingly unwell, attributing her malaise initially to the close atmosphere of the season and the emotional strain of her deteriorating relationship with Adrian. But when the nausea persisted through July and into August, accompanied by other telltale signs, she was forced to confront an unexpected reality. She was with child. The physician confirmed what she had already suspected, offering congratulations that felt hollow in her ears. A child should have been a blessing, a joy to be shared between husband and wife. Instead, Georgiana felt only a complex mixture of apprehension and determination. This child would be the heir Adrian needed, the continuation of his line that society demanded. Perhaps it would finally give her a purpose in his life beyond being an inconvenient obligation. She wrote to Adrian, who had departed for his estate in Kent 3 days prior without informing her of his departure. The letter was brief and factual. Your Grace, I write to inform you that the physician has confirmed I am with child. The confinement is expected in late December. I trust this news meets with your approval. Georgiana. His response arrived a week later, equally brief. Duchess, I am pleased to learn of this development. I shall make arrangements to return to London when your confinement draws near. Until then, I trust you will take every precaution with your health. The continuance of the Ravenmoor line is of paramount importance. Adrian. Not a word of concern for her well-being. Not a question about her health beyond its relevance to producing his heir. Georgiana folded the letter carefully and placed it in her writing desk, next to Victoria's request for wedding gifts and her father's perfunctory thanks. A collection of correspondences that demonstrated precisely how much she meant to those who should have valued her most. As autumn arrived and London society dispersed to country estates for the shooting season, Georgiana found herself unexpectedly grateful to return to Ravenmoor in Devonshire. The estate had become more her home than any place she had known, and the familiar faces of the servants and tenants offered a comfort that London's glittering ballrooms never had. The pregnancy proved difficult from the outset. Georgiana suffered debilitating nausea that left her weak and unable to keep food down for days at a time. The physician prescribed bed rest, which she followed reluctantly, chafing at the enforced inactivity. Her one consolation came in the form of the Dowager Duchess Clarissa, who arrived uninvited in October and announced her intention to remain until after the confinement. Someone must ensure you are properly cared for, Clarissa declared, settling herself into the best guest chamber with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. My grandson is too foolish to recognize his responsibilities, so I shall undertake them myself. The old woman proved to be surprisingly good company. She read aloud from the latest novels, engaged Georgiana in spirited debates about politics and philosophy, and spoke with refreshing candor about Adrian's failures as a husband. His father was precisely the same, Clarissa said one afternoon as they sat together in Georgiana's sitting room, the November rain beating against the windows. My son married for beauty and birth, never once considering whether his wife possessed the character necessary for true partnership. Poor Eleanor, Adrian's mother, was lovely to look upon but fragile in spirit. She withered under my son's cold attention, much as you are withering under Adrian's neglect. I am not withering, Georgiana protested weakly, though even she could hear the lack of conviction in her voice. No, Clarissa raised an eyebrow. You are carrying his child, enduring a difficult pregnancy alone, and he has not so much as written to inquire after your health beyond that first formal note. If you are not withering, child, you possess a stronger constitution than most. He will come when the time approaches, Georgiana said, though she was not certain she believed it. He will come because duty demands it, Clarissa corrected. Not because he cares, not because he worries, but because it would look improper if he failed to attend the birth of his heir. I love my grandson, Georgiana, but I am not blind to his faults. He has been raised to value all the wrong things, and I fear it may take something catastrophic to teach him otherwise. Adrian finally returned in early December, precisely 3 weeks before the physician predicted her confinement would begin. He arrived without warning, his carriage clattering into the courtyard on a bitterly cold afternoon. Georgiana, who had been attempting to walk the corridors for exercise despite her physician's disapproval, was caught by surprise when Dawson announced his arrival. "Your Grace is here?" she repeated, one hand pressed to the small of her aching back. "I received no word of his coming. Nevertheless, he is here, Your Grace, and requests an audience in the library." Georgiana found Adrian standing by the fireplace, still in his traveling clothes, staring into the flames. He turned when she entered, and she saw his eyes widen fractionally as he took in her altered appearance. At 8 months pregnant, she could no longer disguise her condition, her figure swollen and ungainly in a way that surely confirmed every negative opinion he held about her lack of beauty. "Your Grace," she greeted him with a curtsy that was more difficult than it should have been. "You should not be curtsying in your condition," Adrian said, his voice sharp with something that might have been concern, or merely irritation at impropriety. "Please, be seated." Georgiana lowered herself carefully into a chair, grateful for the support. "I was not expecting you for another fortnight." "I thought it prudent to arrive early," Adrian replied, though he did not elaborate on his reasoning. "How are you feeling?" "As well as can be expected, given the circumstances." Georgiana folded her hands over her swollen abdomen. "The physician assures me that despite the difficulties, both the child and I are healthy." "Good. That is good." Adrian seemed at a loss for what else to say, his discomfort with the situation evident in his rigid posture and averted gaze. The weeks that followed were marked by a careful politeness between them that was somehow worse than open hostility. Adrian took his meals separately, citing a state business that required his attention. He inquired after Georgiana's health each morning, with the same formulaic courtesy one might extend to a valued but distant acquaintance. At night, she could sometimes hear him pacing in the room adjacent to hers, and wondered what kept him wakeful. The pains began on a frigid December night, 3 days earlier than the physician had predicted. Georgiana woke to a cramping sensation that intensified with frightening rapidity. Mrs. Talbot, who had been sleeping in the adjoining dressing room, immediately sent for the physician and the midwife, then went to inform the Duke. What followed were hours of agony that blurred together in Georgiana's memory. The physician's grave expression, the midwife's encouraging words that failed to mask her concern, Clarissa's hand gripping hers as another contraction tore through her body. At some point, she heard voices outside her chamber door, heard the physician's somber tones as he spoke to someone in the corridor. "The labor is not progressing as it should. There are complications. I cannot guarantee the outcome for either mother or child." Adrian's voice responded, though Georgiana could not make out the words through the fog of pain and exhaustion. The night stretched on, each hour more difficult than the last. Georgiana felt herself weakening, felt her strength ebbing with each push that brought no result. She thought of her unborn child, of the life that depended on her endurance, and found reserves she had not known she possessed. Finally, as dawn broke pale and cold over the Devonshire countryside, a thin cry pierced the air. The midwife held up a tiny, red-faced infant, and Georgiana collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face. "A daughter, Your Grace," the midwife announced, small but healthy. "A beautiful little girl. A daughter." Not the son Adrian surely wanted. Georgiana felt a moment of fear that this too would be added to her list of failures in his eyes. But she was too exhausted to dwell on it, her body demanding rest after its ordeal. "The Duchess?" she heard someone ask, the voice seeming to come from very far away. "Weak, but she will recover," the physician replied. It was a near thing, though. Another hour, and we might have lost them both. When Georgiana woke, sunlight was streaming through the windows, and Clarissa sat beside her bed, knitting with determined focus. "The baby," Georgiana managed to whisper, her throat raw. "In the nursery, being attended by a wet nurse," Clarissa assured her. "She is perfectly well, child. Small but vigorous. You did admirably. Adrian?" Something flickered across Clarissa's face. "He spent the entire night in the corridor outside your door. The physician told him the situation was grave, that he might lose both of you. I have never seen my grandson so undone. He paced like a caged animal, refusing to leave, refusing even to sit. When we heard the baby cry, I thought he might weep with relief. Georgiana absorbed this information, unsure what to make of it. Has he seen her? He visited the nursery an hour ago, stood looking at her for the longest time without speaking. It was 3 days before Georgiana was strong enough to leave her bed, and another week before she felt capable of receiving visitors beyond Clarissa and Mrs. Talbot. Adrian came to her sitting room one afternoon, formal and correct in his dark coat, his expression carefully neutral. "I am glad to see you recovering," he said, remaining standing near the door as though ready to flee at the first opportunity. "Thank you, Your Grace. I am feeling much stronger. I visited the nursery this morning. She is a fine child." "Yes. I thought, if it pleased you, we might name her Eleanor, after your mother." Adrian's carefully maintained composure cracked for just a moment, surprise and something deeper flickering across his features. "That would be most appropriate. Thank you. She is your daughter, Your Grace. You should have some say in her naming." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Finally, Adrian cleared his throat. "I must return to London shortly. There are matters requiring my attention, but I have arranged for additional staff to assist with the child's care. You need only send word if you require anything." Of course he was leaving. Georgiana felt a weary resignation settle over her. "As you wish, Your Grace." After he departed, she remained seated by the fire, staring into the flames. She had given Adrian his child, had nearly died in the process, and his response was to flee to London at the first opportunity. Whatever she had hoped might change between them had been thoroughly extinguished. The winter months passed in a haze of recovery and new motherhood. Georgiana found unexpected joy in little Eleanor, who proved to be a demanding but delightful infant. The child had Adrian's dark hair and his gray-blue eyes, but her temperament seemed to favor her mother, curious and observant even in infancy. Spring brought an unexpected visitor. Christopher Wainwright arrived at Ravenmoor one mild April morning, carrying a small gift for the new arrival, and an invitation for Georgiana to take a turn about the gardens when she felt strong enough. "Mr. Wainwright," Georgiana greeted him warmly, genuinely pleased to see a friendly face. "This is a surprise. I did not know you were in Devonshire. I am staying with my uncle at Thornbury Hall, just 10 miles distant," Christopher explained. "I heard about the birth and wished to offer my congratulations. I hope I am not intruding." "Not at all. Your timing is perfect. I was just preparing to take Eleanor for some air. Would you care to join us?" They walked through the gardens, which were beginning to show the first signs of spring growth, with Eleanor bundled in Georgiana's arms. Christopher entertained them with stories of his travels and business ventures, asking thoughtful questions about the estate and listening with genuine interest to Georgiana's answers. It was the kind of easy, comfortable companionship she had missed desperately during her long isolation. They had paused beside the rose garden, Christopher bending to examine the new growth on the bushes, while Georgiana pointed out her plans for expansion, when a voice interrupted them. "I was not aware we were expecting guests." Georgiana turned to find Adrian standing on the terrace, his expression thunderous despite his carefully controlled tone. She had not known he was at Ravenmoor, had received no word of his return from London. "Your Grace," she said, surprised. "Mr. Wainwright was kind enough to call with a gift for Eleanor. We were merely taking the air." Adrian's gaze moved from Georgiana to Christopher, to the baby in her arms, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Wainwright, I trust your visit has been satisfactory." There was ice in his voice, a clear dismissal. Christopher, no fool, immediately bowed to Georgiana. "I should not overstay my welcome. Duchess, thank you for your hospitality. Perhaps I might call again when it is more convenient?" "You are always welcome here, Mr. Wainwright," Georgiana said firmly, though she saw the muscle jump in Adrian's jaw at her words. After Christopher had departed, Adrian descended from the terrace and approached Georgiana with measured steps. "It is not appropriate for you to receive gentlemen callers in my absence. Mr. Wainwright is an old friend," Georgiana replied, her own temper beginning to rise. "His visit was entirely proper and in full view of the household. Or do you suggest that new mothers should be imprisoned without company?" I suggest that a duchess should be mindful of her reputation and that of her husband, Adrian countered coldly. Strange, Georgiana said, shifting Eleanor's weight in her arms. You have shown little concern for our shared reputation in the year of our marriage. You have publicly ignored me, abandoned me, left me to face society's censure alone. But the moment an old friend shows me kindness, suddenly you are concerned with propriety? That is different. How? Georgiana demanded. How is it different, Your Grace? Because you are the Duke and can do as you please, while I must remain silent and grateful for any crumb of attention you deign to show me. Adrian's hands clenched at his sides. You go too far, madam. I do not go nearly far enough, Georgiana replied, exhaustion and pent-up frustration finally breaking through her careful control. I have given you everything required of me. I have managed your estate, borne your child, maintained your household, all while you have made it abundantly clear that you find my presence burdensome. Perhaps it would be better for both of us if we formalized what has been our practice. I will remain here at Ravenmoor with Eleanor, and you may live as you please in London. Adrian stared at her, something flickering in his eyes that might have been shock, or perhaps even hurt. You wish to live separately? I wish for many things, Your Grace, that I have learned I will never have. But yes, a formal separation of households seems the most honest arrangement for a marriage that exists only on paper. For a long moment, Adrian said nothing. Then he nodded stiffly. If that is what you desire, I will not stand in your way. I shall make the necessary arrangements. As he walked away, his shoulders rigid with some emotion Georgiana could not identify. She felt both relief and a hollow ache she refused to acknowledge as grief. Eleanor stirred in her arms, making the small sounds that preceded crying, and Georgiana held her daughter close, finding comfort in the warm weight of the one good thing her marriage had produced. The arrangement, once formalized, became the pattern of their existence. Adrian departed for London within the week, leaving behind detailed instructions for financial matters and a formal schedule of visitation. He would return to Ravenmoor 3 times annually to see his daughter, at midsummer, at Christmas, and at Easter. Each visit would last no more than a fortnight. The efficiency of the arrangement was matched only by its emotional emptiness. Georgiana found, to her surprise, that she did not mourn Adrian's absence, as she might have expected. Instead, she felt a curious sense of liberation. Without the constant weight of his disapproval and indifference pressing upon her, she discovered reserves of energy and purpose she had not known she possessed. Eleanor grew from infant to curious child during those 2 years, her development a source of constant wonder to Georgiana. By her first birthday, she was walking unsteadily about the nursery, babbling in a language only she understood. By 18 months, she had begun forming words, and by 2 years of age, she possessed a vocabulary that astonished everyone who encountered her. She had inherited her father's dark hair and penetrating gray-blue eyes, but her temperament was entirely her own. Inquisitive, determined, affectionate, Georgiana spent her days divided between Eleanor and the estate. The hospital she had established in the village flourished under the care of a retired army surgeon who had settled in the area. She implemented a program of small loans for tenant farmers who wished to improve their holdings, and was gratified to see the investments pay dividends in increased productivity and prosperity. The school grew from a single room to 3, with additional teachers hired to accommodate the growing number of students. The servants no longer regarded her with wariness, but with genuine affection and respect. Mrs. Talbot had become a trusted confidant. Dawson treated her with grandfatherly approval, and even the youngest kitchen maid would smile and curtsy with evident pleasure when the Duchess passed through. Christopher Wainwright maintained his friendship through regular correspondence. His letters arrived monthly, filled with observations about London society, questions about agricultural innovations, and gentle humor that never failed to lift Georgiana's spirits. She wrote back with equal regularity, sharing her successes and frustrations with the estate, describing Eleanor's latest achievements, and engaging in the kind of intellectual discourse she had always craved. There was nothing improper in their exchanges, nothing that could not have been read aloud in any drawing room, but they provided Georgiana with a connection to a world beyond Ravenmoor's boundaries. Adrian's visits followed the prescribed pattern with mechanical precision. He would arrive on the appointed day, spend formal time with Eleanor in the nursery, review estate accounts with Thomas Whitley, and maintain polite but distant interactions with Georgiana. During his Christmas visit, when Eleanor was just past her first birthday, he observed her taking her first steps, and something almost resembling pleasure had crossed his features. But he spoke little, praised less, and departed on schedule without extending his stay even a single day. Each visit brought home to Adrian the uncomfortable reality that Ravenmore had never run more smoothly. The tenants had never been more content, and Eleanor had never lacked for maternal devotion. The servants spoke of the Duchess with warmth and admiration. The tenants petitioned to name the new village square after her, and his daughter clearly adored her mother with uncomplicated joy. All of this should have pleased him. Instead, it created a growing disquiet he could not quite name. London, by contrast, felt increasingly hollow. Adrian maintained his club memberships, attended the necessary social functions, managed his investments with his usual competence, but the activities that had once occupied him now seemed pointless. Beautiful women at balls no longer captured his attention as they once had. Their conversation, which he had previously found adequate if not stimulating, now struck him as vapid. He found himself comparing them to Georgiana unfavorably, and wondered when his plain wife had become the standard against which others were measured. His visits to his grandmother became more frequent. Clarissa never failed to inquire after Georgiana and Eleanor, and never failed to point out Adrian's failures as a husband and father. Her criticisms grew less subtle with each visit. "You are wasting your life in this city," she told him one autumn afternoon in her Mayfair townhouse. "While your wife builds something of value in Devonshire, you chase shadows and call it society. I have responsibilities here," Adrian replied defensively. "Responsibilities," Clarissa scoffed. "You have habits, not responsibilities. When did you last do something that mattered, Adrian? When did you last feel anything beyond mild satisfaction or mild dissatisfaction?" He had no answer for her. In May of 1811, Victoria married Sir Michael Thornbury in a lavish ceremony at St. George's, Hanover Square. Adrian and Georgiana were both in attendance, though they arrived separately and maintained the fiction of a marriage that existed in name only. It was the first time they had seen each other in 9 months. Adrian barely recognized his wife when she entered the church. Georgiana wore a gown of deep rose silk that brought warmth to her complexion, her hair arranged in a style that was both elegant and becoming. But it was not her appearance that struck him, though she looked undeniably well. It was the way she carried herself, the confidence in her bearing, the ease with which she moved through the assembled guests. Men whose opinions Adrian respected approached her with genuine pleasure, engaging her in conversation that clearly interested them. Women who had once dismissed her now sought her company. Victoria, radiant in her wedding finery, embraced her sister with enthusiasm. "Dearest Georgiana, I am so grateful for all you have done. The settlement the Duke provided was most generous." Then, without waiting for a response, she turned immediately to Adrian. "Your Grace, how wonderful that you could attend. You must tell me all about London. I hear Lady Pemberton's ball last month was absolutely spectacular." Adrian watched Georgiana's expression as Victoria chattered on about London society, without once inquiring about her sister's life at Ravenmore, or asking after Eleanor. He saw the flicker of resignation in Georgiana's eyes, the way she smiled and murmured appropriate responses, while clearly recognizing that she had become merely a means to an end for the sister she had sacrificed so much to help. Throughout the wedding breakfast, Adrian found himself watching Georgiana more than was entirely proper. She spoke with Christopher Wainwright, who had apparently maintained his acquaintance, and the easy warmth between them created an uncomfortable tightness in Adrian's chest that he refused to identify as jealousy. She conversed with the Earl of Dartmouth about parliamentary reform, demonstrating a knowledge of politics that impressed even that astute gentleman. She held court, in her quiet way, among people who valued substance over superficial charm. Adrian realized with uncomfortable clarity that Georgiana had somehow become admirable in her own right, quite separate from her role as his duchess. More unsettling still, he recognized that he envied those who received her genuine smiles and engaged conversation, privileges he had long since forfeited through his own coldness. The disquiet that had been growing in him intensified after Victoria's wedding. He returned to London and threw himself into a new investment scheme, joining with several other gentlemen in a shipping venture that promised substantial returns. For months, everything proceeded according to plan. Then, in the autumn of 1812, news arrived that 3 of their ships had been lost in a storm, and the entire enterprise teetered on the edge of collapse. Adrian's fellow investors panicked, proposing increasingly desperate measures to salvage what they could. But Adrian, remembering Georgiana's facility with accounts and estate management, did something he had never done before. He swallowed his pride and wrote to his wife, enclosing detailed information about the investments and asking for her analysis. Her response arrived within a week, and Adrian opened it with trepidation. What he found was a masterwork of financial reasoning. Georgiana had examined every aspect of the venture, identified which elements were salvageable and which must be abandoned, and proposed a restructuring that would minimize losses while positioning them to recover when shipping conditions improved. Her analysis was clear, thorough, and brilliant in its understanding of both immediate concerns and long-term strategy. Adrian followed her recommendations precisely. Within months, it became clear that her advice had saved him and his fellow investors from catastrophic loss. What might have bankrupted lesser men became instead a manageable setback, followed by eventual recovery. He wrote to thank her, a brief note that expressed appreciation for her assistance. But even as he sealed the letter, Adrian found himself troubled by a question that would not leave him in peace. Why had he spent years valuing beauty and charm in other women, when his own wife possessed a capability and intelligence that far exceeded such superficial qualities? And more disturbingly, what did it say about him that he had failed to recognize her worth until now? In Devonshire, Georgiana read Adrian's thank you note with mixed feelings. She was glad her advice had proven useful, satisfied that her abilities had been demonstrated in a way even Adrian could not dismiss. But the brevity of his gratitude, the continued formality of their separation, reminded her that intellectual respect was not the same as genuine partnership, and that her husband, for all his title and wealth, remained as distant from her as he had been on their wedding day. The winter of 1812 arrived with unusual severity, coating Devonshire in layers of ice and snow that transformed Ravenmore Estate into a landscape of crystalline beauty. Adrian had not intended to return for Christmas, citing pressing business in London that required his attention. But Clarissa, exercising the prerogative of age and family connection, had written to inform him that she was hosting a gathering of neighboring families at Ravenmore, and his presence was not requested, but commanded. "You will attend," her letter stated with characteristic bluntness, "or I shall inform everyone in London that my grandson is too cowardly to face his own wife for more than a fortnight at a time. Your choice, Adrian." Thus compelled, Adrian found himself traveling through snow-laden roads to arrive at Ravenmore on a bitter December afternoon. He had not been to the estate for more than 2 days consecutively in over 2 years, and the familiarity of the approach unsettled him in ways he could not articulate. Dawson greeted him with the same formal courtesy as always, but Adrian detected a subtle coolness in the butler's manner that had not been present in years past. The servants, he realized with uncomfortable awareness, had chosen their loyalty, and it was not to him. Eleanor was in the nursery when Adrian arrived, and he climbed the stairs with a hesitation that would have surprised anyone who knew him. His daughter at 3 years of age was a miniature whirlwind of energy and curiosity, her dark hair escaping from its ribbons, her gray-blue eyes bright with intelligence. When he entered, she stopped mid-play and regarded him with solemn assessment. "You are Papa," she said finally, as though confirming a fact she had learned from books rather than experience. "I am," Adrian replied, kneeling to bring himself to her level, "and you have grown considerably since I last saw you." Eleanor considered this. "Mama says I am getting tall. She says I shall be as tall as you someday. But I do not think that is possible because you are very tall indeed. Your mama is wise," Adrian said, feeling an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. "What were you playing? Building a castle? But it keeps falling down because the blocks are not balanced properly." She frowned at the offending structure with an expression so reminiscent of Georgiana's thoughtful concentration that Adrian felt another uncomfortable pang. "May I help?" he asked, and was rewarded with a cautious nod. They spent the next hour constructing and reconstructing Eleanor's castle, and Adrian discovered that his daughter possessed both her mother's intelligence and a surprisingly stubborn determination. When the structure finally stood complete, Eleanor clapped her hands with delight and then, with unself-conscious affection, climbed into Adrian's lap to admire their work. It was there that Georgiana found them when she came to fetch Eleanor for tea. She stopped in the doorway, surprise evident on her features, and Adrian felt suddenly, inexplicably ashamed to be caught in this moment of paternal tenderness, as though it revealed a vulnerability he had no right to display. "Your Grace," Georgiana said quietly, "I did not realize you had arrived." "An hour passed," Adrian replied, gently disentangling himself from Eleanor's embrace and standing. "I was becoming acquainted with our daughter." "Our daughter knows you well enough from the miniature in the drawing room," Georgiana said, and though her tone was even, Adrian heard the implicit criticism. "Eleanor, come. It is time for tea." Over the following days, Adrian found himself observing his wife with a new awareness that was profoundly uncomfortable. He watched her move through the house with easy authority, saw how the servants anticipated her needs, and fulfilled them with evident pleasure rather than mere duty. He noticed how she spoke to everyone from the highest footman to the youngest kitchen maid with the same courtesy and genuine interest. He observed her with Eleanor, patient and playful, educational and affectionate in equal measure. On the third evening, unable to sleep, Adrian descended to the library in search of a book that might occupy his restless mind. The fire had burned low, but still provided enough light to navigate the shelves. It was while reaching for a volume of essays that he dislodged a slim journal that had been wedged behind the larger books, clearly forgotten. He recognized Georgiana's handwriting on the cover, her name and the year 1808, the year of their marriage. Every instinct of propriety told him to return it unread to its hiding place. But curiosity, and perhaps something deeper, compelled him to carry it to the chair by the dying fire and open its pages. The early entries were brief: observations about Ravenmore's beauty, notes about household management, small hopes expressed with painful delicacy. Then came longer passages, dated from their first months together, that struck Adrian with the force of physical blows. "I find myself hoping that he might come to see me as something more than an obligation. Today I arrange the library exactly as I know he prefers, with his favorite chair positioned to catch the afternoon light. He did not notice. Perhaps tomorrow I shall find some small way to please him." Page after page documented Georgiana's efforts to bridge the chasm between them. Efforts Adrian had not merely ignored, but had been entirely unaware of. Her pain was rendered in careful, controlled language that somehow made it more devastating than dramatic declarations would have been. The final entry, dated 6 months into their marriage, was shortest of all. "I have accepted that I am wife in name alone. I shall cease these futile attempts to earn regard I can never possess. Instead, I will find purpose where I can, in this estate and its people. They, at least, do not find me lacking." Adrian closed the journal with hands that trembled slightly. He sat in the darkness as the fire died to embers, and for perhaps the first time in his adult life, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had done. Not the public humiliation at the altar, though that was grievous enough, but the sustained daily cruelty of indifference, the casual dismissal of a woman who had asked for nothing except to be seen. The following morning, he sought out his grandmother, who was taking breakfast in her chambers. "You look terrible," Clarissa observed with her usual candor. "Sleepless night? I found something," Adrian said without preamble. "A journal of Georgiana's from our early marriage. I should not have read it, but I did." "And what did you learn?" Clarissa set down her teacup with deliberate care. "That I am precisely the fool you have always claimed." Adrian moved to the window, unable to meet his grandmother's gaze. "That she tried, grandmother. She tried to build something between us, and I was too blind, too convinced of my own rightness to even notice. Beauty fades," Clarissa said quietly. "Character endures. How many times must I tell you this before you comprehend it? She is extraordinary," Adrian said, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "The estate, the tenants, Eleanor, everything she touches flourishes. and I have treated her with less regard than I would show a competent steward. Yes, Clarissa agreed simply. You have. The question now is what you intend to do about it. Adrian attempted to approach Georgiana over the following days, but she maintained a polite distance that was more effective than any wall. Their conversations remained superficial, focused on estate matters or Eleanor's progress. She answered his questions with perfect courtesy and avoided any topic that might lead to genuine connection. Then Eleanor fell ill. It began with a slight fever that the physician initially dismissed as common childhood complaint. But by the second day, the fever had spiked alarmingly, and Eleanor lay listless in her bed, her small face flushed and her breath coming in shallow pants. The physician's expression grew grave as he examined her. At last the fever broke, leaving the nursery washed in a wan winter light. When Georgiana slept at last, Adrian carried the basin away, and seeking a book to keep himself from waking her, found instead a slim journal half buried behind Sterne and Addison. He read what she had written in those first months. Not complaint, but the quiet ledger of a wife's attempts refused. When he closed the cover, his hands would not quite steady. By morning, the endowment papers were drawn. We must work to bring the fever down, he said. Cool compresses, constant vigilance. The next day or two will be critical. Georgiana did not leave Eleanor's side. Adrian watched from the doorway as she bathed their daughter's burning skin with cool water, murmured soothing words, held her when she cried. She did not sleep, did not eat, her entire focus on the small figure in the bed. On the second night, when the fever reached its peak and the physician admitted he could do nothing more but wait, Adrian pulled a chair to the opposite side of Eleanor's bed and sat. You should rest, Georgiana said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. I can manage. I know you can, Adrian replied quietly. But she is my daughter too. Let me help. Through that long night, they worked in silent partnership, changing compresses, administering the physician's remedies, taking turns holding Eleanor when she grew restless. As dawn broke pale and cold through the windows, Eleanor's breathing finally steadied, and her fever began to break. Georgiana wept then, quiet tears of relief and exhaustion streaming down her face as she held their sleeping daughter. Adrian reached across the bed and took her hand, and for a moment, she did not pull away. She will be well, the physician confirmed when he arrived that morning. The crisis has passed. You both did admirably. After Eleanor had been settled with a nurse, and Georgiana had been persuaded to rest, Adrian requested that she meet him in the library. She came, still wearing the same dress she had worn for 2 days, her hair escaping its pins, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. I owe you an apology, Adrian began without preamble. Not just for the past days, but for the past years of our marriage. I have failed you in every way that matters. Georgiana studied him with eyes that revealed nothing. Why now, Your Grace? What has changed? I have changed, Adrian said, though the words felt insufficient. Or rather, I am beginning to see what I should have seen from the beginning. You asked for nothing except basic courtesy, and I could not even provide that. You have built something remarkable here, raised our daughter with love and wisdom, proven yourself in every way. And I have been too arrogant, too blinded by values my father taught me to appreciate any of it. Pretty words, Georgiana said tiredly. I have learned not to trust words, Your Grace. Then trust actions, Adrian replied. Give me the opportunity to prove that I can be better than I have been. Not because duty demands it, but because you deserve a husband who values you, who sees you, who honors what you have accomplished. Georgiana was silent for a long moment. You hurt me, she said finally, her voice steady but soft. You have hurt me consistently and thoroughly. I have built a life here that sustains me precisely because I learned not to need you. If you truly wish to change, to repair what has been broken, it will require more than apologies. It will require sustained, consistent evidence that you mean what you say. I understand, Adrian said, and I am willing to earn your trust, however long that may take. For Eleanor's sake, Georgiana said carefully, I am willing to attempt a more civil coexistence. But do not mistake civility for forgiveness, Your Grace. That must be earned, if it can be earned at all. It was not the reconciliation Adrian might have hoped for, but it was more than he deserved, and he knew it. Spring arrived at Ravenmoor with a profusion of wildflowers and renewed life that seemed to mirror the tentative thaw between Adrian and Georgiana. True to his word, Adrian had remained at the estate, rather than fleeing to London at the first opportunity. The decision clearly unsettled him, but he persevered, navigating the unfamiliar rhythms of daily life at Ravenmoor with the determination of a man learning an entirely new language. He began joining Georgiana for breakfast, an innovation that startled the servants and created an unexpected intimacy. Those morning meals were initially silent affairs, punctuated only by the rustle of correspondence and the clink of china, but gradually, conversation emerged. Georgiana would mention a tenant's request or a planned improvement, and Adrian would ask questions that revealed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. "The Hendersons are requesting permission to expand their dairy operation," Georgiana said one April morning, reviewing a letter. "They believe the demand from the village would support additional production. What are your thoughts?" Adrian asked, setting aside his newspaper. "I think it's sound. They are industrious and capable, but it would require an initial investment for equipment and additional stock. Then we should provide it," Adrian said. "Would you draft the terms?" "Your understanding of such matters exceeds mine considerably." The acknowledgement, simple though it was, represented a shift that Georgiana recognized, but did not entirely trust. She merely nodded and made a note to discuss the matter with Thomas Whitley. By May, Adrian had begun accompanying Georgiana on her visits to the tenants' cottages. He observed how she knew each family by name, inquired after sick children and aging grandparents, offered practical advice on everything from crop rotation to household economy. The tenants treated her with a warmth and respect that clearly surprised him. "You have built something remarkable here," Adrian said as they walked back from the village one afternoon. "These people do not merely respect you. They genuinely care for you. I have tried to care for them in return," Georgiana replied. "People respond to genuine concern. It is not complicated." Yet, it was complicated, Adrian realized. It required consistent attention, authentic interest, and a willingness to see beyond one's own concerns, all qualities he had failed to demonstrate in his marriage. Their evenings fell into a pattern that was surprisingly comfortable. They dined together, engaging in conversations that grew progressively more substantial. Adrian discovered that Georgiana had read widely in philosophy and political economy, that she held informed opinions on matters he had assumed would bore any woman. More surprising still, he found himself stimulated by her intellect, enjoying the challenge of debating someone whose reasoning was as sharp as any gentleman's at his club. "You disagree with Smith's assessment of agricultural labor?" he asked one evening, intrigued by her critique of a passage they had both been reading. "I disagree with his assumption that all economic behavior can be reduced to self-interest," Georgiana clarified. "The tenants here often act in ways that benefit their community even at personal cost. Human motivation is more complex than simple calculation of advantage." Adrian found himself smiling. "You should publish your thoughts. They would create quite a stir among the political economists." "Duchesses do not publish," Georgiana said with a slight smile of her own. "We are meant to be decorative, not provocative." "You have never been merely decorative," Adrian said quietly, and was gratified to see a faint blush color her cheeks. Christopher Wainwright's arrival in June tested the fragile progress they had made. He appeared one morning unannounced, bringing gifts for Eleanor and an easy familiarity with Georgiana that made Adrian's chest tighten uncomfortably. Watching them together in the drawing room, seeing the way Christopher made Georgiana laugh with genuine pleasure, Adrian experienced a jealousy that was entirely different from his earlier possessiveness. This was not about ownership, but recognition of potential loss. He found Christopher later in the library, where the younger man was examining Adrian's collection of agricultural texts. "Mr. Wainwright," Adrian said, closing the door behind him. "Might we speak frankly?" Christopher turned, his expression cautious but composed. "Of course, Your Grace. You care for my wife," Adrian stated without preamble. "I do," Christopher admitted without hesitation. "I have cared for Georgiana since we were children. I admire her intelligence, her compassion, her strength of character. But I also respect her marriage vows and her integrity. I would never act dishonorably toward her, nor would she welcome such advances. Yet you maintain your correspondence. As a friend, Christopher replied firmly. Nothing more, though I will not pretend I would not wish for more had circumstances been different. But they are not different. Georgiana is your wife, and she takes her commitments seriously, even when others do not extend her the same courtesy. The rebuke, though gently delivered, struck home. Adrian nodded slowly. I have failed her grievously. Yes, Christopher agreed. You have. The question is whether you intend to continue failing her, or whether you will finally become the husband she deserves. After Christopher departed, Adrian stood in the library for a long time, contemplating what it meant that other men valued what he had dismissed. Georgiana could have encouraged Christopher's affections, could have sought comfort in his obvious devotion. That she had not spoke to a character that Adrian was only beginning to fully appreciate. In August, Georgiana hosted a dinner for neighboring families, the first such entertainment since Adrian's extended residence began. He watched her move through the role of hostess with a grace that had nothing to do with physical beauty, and everything to do with genuine warmth and careful attention to her guests' comfort. Lord Pemberton, a neighbor whose estate adjoined theirs, engaged her in detailed conversation about parliamentary reform. Lady Thornbury sought her advice on establishing a school in her own village. Even the younger guests gravitated toward her, drawn by her ability to converse without condescension. Adrian felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Pride. Not the pride of possession, but genuine admiration for his wife's accomplishments and character. When Lord Pemberton commented on how fortunate Adrian was to have such a capable duchess, Adrian found himself agreeing with complete sincerity. Indeed, I am more fortunate than I deserve, Adrian replied, his gaze finding Georgiana across the room. September brought cooler weather and longer walks through Ravenmoor's extensive grounds. One afternoon, as they strolled through the gardens where autumn roses still bloomed, Georgiana mentioned her desire to expand the village school. The current building can barely accommodate the students we have, she explained. I would like to construct an addition, perhaps hire another teacher for the older children. Some show real promise and could benefit from more advanced instruction. Then we shall do it, Adrian said immediately. I should like to be involved in the planning, if you would permit it. Education has become a topic of considerable interest to me lately. Georgiana glanced at him with surprise. Truly? You wish to be involved? Very much so. You have built something extraordinary here, Georgiana. I would be honored to contribute to its continuation. They paused beside a stone bench, and Adrian found himself reaching for her hand before conscious thought could intervene. She did not pull away, though neither did she return the pressure of his fingers. It was progress, however small, and Adrian recognized it as such. Thank you, Georgiana said softly. Your support would be welcome. A letter arrived in October from Viscount Fairmont, and Adrian intercepted it before it could reach Georgiana. The content was predictable. More gambling debts, more desperate pleas for assistance, more demands couched as paternal privilege. Adrian read it with growing anger, not at the request itself, but at the years of exploitation it represented. Without consulting Georgiana, Adrian traveled to London. He met with the Viscount's creditors, paid the most pressing debts, and then arranged for a small property in the country to be purchased and placed in trust. It would generate modest income, enough to live on if managed properly, but structured so that Fairmont could not gamble it away or demand its sale. When he returned to Ravenmoor and informed Georgiana of what he had done, she studied him with an expression he could not quite read. You did not need to do that, she said finally. Yes, I did, Adrian replied. Not for your father, who has taken advantage of you for years without gratitude or concern for your welfare, but for you, so that you need never again sacrifice your own peace for his poor choices. Georgiana's eyes glistened slightly. That is perhaps the kindest thing you have ever done for me. It is merely the beginning, Adrian said quietly. I have years of kindness to make up for, Georgiana, if you will let me try. She nodded slowly, and though she did not say she would forgive him, Neither did she refuse his hand when he offered it as they walked back to the house together. Winter descended upon Ravenmoor with a ferocity that even the oldest tenants could not recall. Snow fell in thick curtains, transforming the estate into a landscape of pristine white, broken only by the dark skeletal branches of ancient oaks. The cold drove everyone indoors, and for Adrian and Georgiana, the enforced proximity created an intimacy that had eluded them in warmer months. Their evenings settled into a pattern that felt surprisingly natural. After Eleanor had been put to bed, they would retire to the library, where a fire always burned bright against the winter chill. Adrian would select a volume from the shelves while Georgiana worked on correspondence or reviewed estate accounts. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable, but companionable, punctuated occasionally by the turning of pages or the crack of settling logs. "Listen to this," Adrian said one particularly frigid January evening, looking up from his book. "Burke argues that society is a partnership, not only between the living, but between those who are dead and those yet to be born. An interesting perspective on obligation, do you not think?" Georgiana set down her pen. "It suggests that our choices affect more than ourselves, that we hold the estate, the title, even our marriage in trust for Eleanor, and whatever children may come after. Do you believe that?" Adrian asked quietly. "That we might have more children?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Georgiana met his gaze steadily. "I believe that if we continue as we have been, building trust and partnership, then perhaps many things become possible that once seemed impossible." And it was not a declaration, but neither was it a rejection, and Adrian found himself grateful for even that measured hope. Eleanor proved to be the bridge between them in ways neither had anticipated. At 3 years of age, she possessed both her father's determination and her mother's perceptiveness. She had taken to calling Adrian Papa with increasing frequency, the word coming more naturally as his presence became consistent rather than occasional. One morning in late January, Adrian found Eleanor in the entrance hall, dressed in her warmest coat and stamping her small feet impatiently. "Papa, you promised to show me the horses today," she announced with the imperious tone of a duchess in miniature. "Mama says I must wait for you, but I have been waiting forever." "Forever?" Adrian asked, amused. "And how long is forever to someone who has lived only 3 years?" "At least 10 minutes," Eleanor replied with perfect seriousness. True to his word, Adrian led his daughter to the stables, where a gentle pony had been prepared for her introduction to riding. Georgiana accompanied them, and Adrian was acutely aware of her watching as he lifted Eleanor onto the small saddle, keeping one hand on her back for security. "Hold the reins thus," he instructed, guiding Eleanor's small hands. "Gentle but firm. The pony will sense your confidence or your fear. You must be brave but never cruel." "Like Mama with the tenants," Eleanor observed. "She is never cruel, but everyone does what she asks." Adrian glanced at Georgiana, who had the grace to look embarrassed. "Yes, exactly like your mama." They led the pony around the paddock for nearly an hour, Eleanor's delighted laughter ringing out in the cold air. When her nose had turned pink from the chill, they returned to the house, Eleanor chattering excitedly about when she might ride a proper horse instead of a baby pony. "You were wonderful with her," Georgiana said, as they watched Eleanor run ahead to tell Mrs. Talbot about her adventures. "I have missed so much of her life," Adrian replied quietly. "Years I can never reclaim, but perhaps I might do better going forward." "Yes," Georgiana agreed. "Perhaps you might." The invitation to the Haversham Ball in mid-January arrived with the usual formal language and elaborate script. Lord and Lady Haversham hosted the event annually, and attendance by all neighboring families was expected. Adrian and Georgiana had not attended a social function together since Victoria's wedding more than 2 years prior, and the prospect created a tension between them that neither acknowledged directly. On the evening of the ball, Georgiana descended the stairs wearing a gown of deep emerald silk that brought warmth to her complexion and highlighted the gold flecks in her brown eyes. Adrian, waiting at the bottom of the stairs, found himself momentarily unable to speak. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense, would never be the woman who turned heads upon entering a room, but there was something in her bearing, in the quiet confidence of her manner, that made conventional beauty seem somehow irrelevant. "You look well," he said finally, offering his arm. "Thank you," Georgiana replied, placing her hand lightly on his sleeve. "As do you." The ballroom at Haversham Manor was ablaze with candles, the assembled guests already engaged in the first dances of the evening. Adrian led Georgiana through the receiving line, and he noted with satisfaction that several gentlemen nodded to her with genuine warmth, that Lady Haversham greeted her with real pleasure rather than the condescending pity that had once been standard. When the orchestra struck up a waltz, Adrian turned to his wife. "Would you honor me with this dance?" Georgiana hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Yes, I believe I would." They took their positions on the floor, and Adrian was reminded with uncomfortable clarity of their wedding, of his coldness, of his barely concealed disapproval. The memory of that day, of the cruel words he had spoken, rose unbidden in his mind. As they began to move with the music, Adrian cleared his throat. "Georgiana, there is something I must tell you. Not here, not now, but soon. Something I should have said years ago." She looked up at him, questions in her eyes, but the dance separated them before she could respond. When they came together again, Adrian found the words lodged in his throat, inadequate to the magnitude of what he owed her. "Whatever it is," Georgiana said softly, "I will listen when you are ready." February brought a storm of unprecedented violence. The wind howled around Ravenmoor's ancient walls, driving snow and sleet with force enough to shatter windows. In the village, the storm's fury proved even more devastating. Roofs collapsed under the weight of ice, chimneys toppled, and by morning, 6 families were without shelter. Adrian and Georgiana worked together without discussion or need for coordination. She organized the women to prepare hot meals and gather blankets. He led the men to shore up damaged structures and arrange temporary housing. For 3 days they barely slept, moving between the manor and the village, ensuring no one suffered from exposure or want. On the 3rd night, as the storm finally exhausted itself, they found themselves alone in the estate office, reviewing the costs of repairs and the supplies that would be needed. Both were covered in dust and grime, exhausted beyond measure, but there was a satisfaction in what they had accomplished together. "We work well as a team," Adrian observed, setting down his pen. "Yes," Georgiana agreed. "We do." "I have been a fool," Adrian said suddenly, the words emerging with the force of something long dammed up. 5 years ago I stood at the altar and spoke words that have haunted every day of our marriage since. I called you plain, Georgiana. I dismissed you as unworthy before I knew anything of your character, your intelligence, your extraordinary capacity for compassion and leadership. Georgiana remained still, listening, her expression carefully neutral. I was raised to value beauty above substance, appearance above character. Adrian continued. My father drilled into me that a duke must marry someone who reflected the greatness of his position, as though greatness could be measured in the symmetry of features or the gold of hair. I absorbed those lessons so completely that I could not see what stood before me. A woman of genuine worth whose value exceeded any superficial standard. He moved closer to her, his voice dropping. You have proven yourself in every way that matters. You have built something extraordinary here. You have raised our daughter with love and wisdom. You have shown me what true capability looks like. And somewhere in the past year, I have fallen in love with you, Georgiana. Not with who I thought you should be, but with who you actually are. Tears glistened in Georgiana's eyes. You hurt me, she said quietly. You hurt me so deeply that I built walls to survive. I learned to live without you, to need nothing from you. Those walls do not simply vanish because you have spoken kind words. I know, Adrian said. I am not asking for forgiveness that I have not earned. I am asking only for the chance to continue earning it, day by day, year by year, for however long it takes. Georgiana was silent for a long moment, studying his face. I am not the same woman who married you, she said finally. I will not be diminished or ignored again. If we are to truly be partners, it must be as equals. I would have it no other way, Adrian replied with complete sincerity. Then I will tell you this, Georgiana said, a small smile touching her lips. I have begun to care for you as well. Not as I did at the beginning, with that desperate hope for crumbs of affection, but as someone who has seen you change, who has watched you become the man you always had the capacity to be. I do not love you yet, Adrian, but I believe I might, in time. Then I will take time, Adrian said, and thank God that you are willing to grant it. Spring arrived at Ravenmoor with an explosion of color and life. The gardens, tended carefully through winter, burst forth with daffodils and crocuses, their bright heads nodding in the gentle breeze. The damage from February's storm had been repaired, the cottages stronger than before, and the tenants approached the planting season with renewed optimism. Adrian found Georgiana in the rose garden one warm April morning, Eleanor at her side examining a ladybug with intense fascination. The sight of them together, mother and daughter in perfect harmony, created an ache in Adrian's chest that was equal parts regret for time lost and gratitude for what remained. "Might I join you?" he asked, approaching carefully. "Please do," Georgiana replied, and the welcome in her voice was genuine. They walked together through the blooming gardens, Eleanor running ahead to chase butterflies and investigate interesting stones. Their conversation flowed easily now, moving from estate matters to books to plans for Eleanor's education. At one point, Adrian reached for Georgiana's hand, half expecting her to pull away. Instead, she allowed her fingers to intertwine with his, the touch both familiar and new. "You are the most extraordinary woman I have ever known," Adrian said quietly. "It took me far too long to recognize that truth, but I am grateful beyond measure that I finally have." Georgiana stopped walking, turning to face him. "I am glad you finally see me," she said simply. "It took a great deal of time and pain to reach this point, but perhaps the difficulty makes it more valuable. We are building something real now, Adrian. Something built on truth rather than obligation." "Yes," he agreed. "Something worth having." Eleanor called out for them to come see a particularly beautiful flower she had discovered, and they continued their walk, hands still joined. It was not the fairy tale ending of romantic novels, not the passionate declaration and immediate reconciliation, but it was real and honest, and held the promise of something more enduring than either had dared hope for in those early, painful years. As they returned to the house, with Eleanor between them now holding both their hands, Adrian looked at his wife and daughter, and felt a contentment he had never known in all his years of seeking validation in superficial achievements. He had called Georgiana plain at the altar, had dismissed her as beneath his notice. Now he understood that true beauty lay not in the arrangement of features, but in the content of character. And by that measure, he had married the most beautiful woman in England. He could only hope that he would spend the rest of their lives proving himself worthy of her.